The first snow of winter had not yet fallen when Duchess Sophie Ashford vanished from Ashford Hall. The morning began like any other upon the vast estate. Servants crossed polished corridors carrying silver trays. Horses stamped inside warm stables. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys beneath a pale English sky. Yet before noon, whispers were spreading through every corner of the manor. The Duchess was gone. A maid discovered her chambers empty. Her gowns remained neatly arranged inside wardrobes. Her jewelry sat untouched upon a dressing table. Nothing suggested haste. Nothing suggested violence. Yet Sophie herself had disappeared as completely as mist dissolving at sunrise. By evening, confusion had become alarm. By midnight, alarm had become scandal. Within days, noble society had already crafted its own version of the story. Some claimed Sophie had fled with another man. Others insisted she had grown weary of married life and abandoned her responsibilities. Those who barely knew her spoke with the greatest confidence, repeating cruel theories beside ballroom fireplaces and banquet tables. Only one man refused to believe any of it. Duke Edward Ashford stood before the cold hearth in his private study and stared at the final note Sophie had left behind. The words were brief. "Forgive me. It is better this way. Nothing more." He had read those words so many times that the ink seemed carved into his memory. Yet something felt wrong. Sophie was not reckless. She was not selfish. She was not cruel. She was gentle in ways most people never noticed. She remembered servants' birthdays. She rescued injured birds from gardens. She spent rainy afternoons reading to children in nearby villages. The woman Edward had married possessed a heart incapable of abandoning those she loved without explanation, which meant someone was lying, or someone had made her leave. The possibility haunted him. Outside the study windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. Edward folded the note once more and slipped it into his coat pocket. He would find her, no matter how long it took. Far from Ashford Hall, however, another story had already begun. Only weeks before her disappearance, Sophie had been living inside a private sorrow she could share with no one. She was carrying Edward's child. The discovery had filled her with joy. For several beautiful days, she imagined placing the newborn into Edward's arms. She imagined tiny footsteps echoing through castle corridors. She imagined a future bright enough to banish every uncertainty she had ever known. Then the letters arrived. The first appeared innocent. The second felt colder. The third shattered her heart. Each carried Edward's signature. Each seemed written by the man she loved. Yet the words felt strangely distant. The letters spoke of regret. They spoke of duty. They spoke of a marriage that had become a burden. One sentence lingered in Sophie's mind long after the pages were folded away. "I fear I chose with my heart when I should have chosen with wisdom." She stared at those words for hours. Then days. Then weeks. Every letter deepened the wound. Unknown to her, Edward had never written a single one. The true author sat comfortably within Ashford Hall itself. Lord Rhys Blackthorne. Edward's cousin possessed charm polished to perfection and ambition sharp enough to draw blood. For years he had watched the Ashford title from the shadows. The duchy was powerful. The estates were vast. The influence stretched across half the kingdom. As long as Edward remained happily married and produced an heir, Rhys would never possess any claim worth pursuing. But a lonely husband without children offered possibilities. And possibilities were all Rhys needed. So he forged letters. He intercepted correspondence. He twisted innocent delays into apparent betrayals. Piece by piece he built an illusion designed to destroy trust. When Edward left Ashford Hall on estate business, Rhys delivered his final deception. A forged letter. A cruel letter. A fatal letter. In it, Edward supposedly confessed that he intended to seek an annulment and marry a more suitable noblewoman. Sophie read the words beneath candlelight. At first she could not breathe. Then she could not stop crying. Hours later she packed a single case. Before dawn arrived, she left Ashford Hall forever. The journey began beneath gray skies and falling rain. Her heart felt hollow. Her future felt uncertain. Yet she carried one precious hope within her. The child. Edward's child. Their child. She clung to that hope while her carriage rolled through muddy roads toward an unknown destination. But fate had not finished testing her. Near a steep hillside, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the carriage. Thunder shook the heavens. The horses panicked. The driver lost control. The carriage overturned. Wood shattered. Glass exploded. The world became darkness and pain. When Sophie awoke days later in a distant village, everything had changed. The baby was gone. The grief nearly destroyed her. For months she moved through life like a ghost, surviving rather than living. She abandoned titles, jewels, and privileges. She disappeared among ordinary people who knew nothing of duchesses or grand estates. Meanwhile, Edward searched relentlessly. He followed rumors across counties, questioned travelers, hired investigators, and spent fortunes pursuing impossible leads. Each trail ended in disappointment. Each failure deepened the ache inside him. Years passed. Seasons changed. Hope faded for everyone except the Duke himself. 5 years later, on a cold autumn evening, Edward stood alone inside his study. A portrait of Sophie rested beside the fireplace. The paint captured her gentle smile so perfectly that sometimes it felt alive. Behind him, estate ledgers waited untouched while Lord Rees handled increasing portions of Ashford affairs. Before him sat maps marked with hundreds of searches. And within him remained the same stubborn certainty that had survived half a decade of heartbreak. Somewhere in the kingdom, Sophie Ashford was still alive. He could feel it, and he was not done looking. 5 years had passed since Sophie Ashford vanished from Ashford Hall, yet the storm inside Edward's heart remained unchanged. Autumn had settled heavily across the countryside. Bare branches clawed at a darkening sky while fierce winds swept through the forests surrounding the Ashford estates. The afternoon had already surrendered to premature dusk when Edward guided his horse along a lonely woodland road. Another search had ended in disappointment. A merchant in a neighboring county had claimed to know a woman matching Sophie's description. Edward had traveled 2 days through rough terrain to investigate the lead, only to discover it was another mistake. The disappointment should have exhausted him. Instead, it sharpened his determination. Every failed search strengthened the strange certainty that had lived inside him for years. Sophie was alive. Somewhere beyond the countless roads, villages, and cities of England, she was still breathing beneath the same sky. Thunder rolled across the horizon. Edward glanced upward. A storm was approaching quickly. Black clouds gathered like armies preparing for battle, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The first cold raindrops struck his coat moments later. Most men would have turned back. Edward pressed forward. The weather matched his mood too perfectly. The forest grew darker with every passing minute. Wind bent the trees into restless silhouettes. Leaves scattered across the muddy road like frightened birds fleeing danger. Then something unusual caught his attention. Movement. Far ahead. At first, he assumed it was merely a fallen branch swaying in the storm. Another flash of lightning illuminated the road, and the shape became clearer. A person. Someone was walking through the rain. Alone. Edward urged his horse forward. As the distance closed, concern replaced curiosity. The figure was a woman. She moved slowly, one hand resting protectively against her swollen stomach. Even from afar, it was obvious she was heavily pregnant. Her clothing was soaked through completely. Mud stained the hem of her worn dress. Each step looked painful. Yet what startled Edward most was not her condition. It was the child beside her. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, struggled through the storm while clutching the woman's hand. The child wore an oversized coat that had clearly belonged to an adult once. The woman kept positioning herself between the girl and the worst of the wind. Even exhausted, she protected the child first. Edward's chest tightened. Whoever she was, she should not have been outside during weather like this. The rain intensified. Within minutes it became a relentless curtain of water. The little girl stumbled. The woman immediately pulled her close and wrapped both arms around her despite visibly struggling to remain standing herself. Edward guided his horse closer. "Madam," he called above the wind. The woman froze. Fear flashed across her face. She stepped backward, instinctively placing herself in front of the child. The reaction spoke of experience. Not pride. Not stubbornness. Fear. The kind earned through hardship. "I mean no harm," Edward said gently. The little girl looked up with wide, frightened eyes. The woman said nothing. Rain streamed down her face as she studied him carefully. Edward noticed how thin she appeared beneath the soaked clothing. Her cheeks were pale. Dark circles rested beneath tired eyes. Yet despite everything, there remained an unmistakable grace about her. Something familiar. Something he could not immediately explain. "You both need shelter," he continued. "We are fine." Her voice was soft and strangely familiar. Edward frowned. The woman lowered her gaze quickly. "Please," he said. "The storm will worsen. We can manage." The little girl shivered violently. The woman immediately removed her own shawl and wrapped it around the child. Edward watched the gesture. Even now, she sacrificed her comfort for someone else. The sight stirred a memory he could not quite grasp. Thunder exploded overhead. The little girl flinched. The woman tightened her hold around her shoulders. Edward was about to insist again when lightning split the sky. For a single brilliant second, the world turned silver. The light struck the woman's chest. Something flashed beneath the rain. A sapphire. Edward's breath stopped. The necklace hanging against her throat was impossible to mistake. A sapphire wedding locket. His wedding locket. 5 years earlier he had commissioned it personally. The jeweler had spent months crafting the piece. No duplicate existed anywhere in the kingdom. Sophie had worn it every day of their marriage. The storm vanished. The road vanished. Everything vanished except that single sapphire gleaming in the lightning. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the woman lifted her face. Their eyes met. The years disappeared. Edward saw the same gentle blue eyes that had haunted every sleepless night. The same face he had searched for across half the kingdom. Older now. Thinner. Marked by hardship. Yet unmistakably hers. His heart slammed against his ribs. Sophie. The name escaped as little more than a whisper. The woman stared at him. Shock flooded her expression. Her lips parted. For several seconds neither moved. Neither breathed. Rain poured around them while 5 years of grief, longing, confusion, and unanswered questions collided between them. Edward, she whispered. The sound shattered something inside him. She remembered him. She was real. Not a memory. Not a dream. Not another false lead. She stood before him beneath the storm. Alive. The little girl looked back and forth between them in confusion. Sophie's eyes filled suddenly with tears. Thousands of words seemed trapped behind them. Regret. Love. Pain. Questions. Explanations. But before any of them could be spoken, her face drained of color. Edward immediately recognized the danger. She had pushed herself too far. For too long. Sophie. He stepped forward. Her knees buckled. The little girl cried out. Edward reached her just as she collapsed. He caught her before she struck the ground. Her body felt frighteningly light. Rain soaked her hair against his arm. For one terrifying moment, he feared he had found her only to lose her again. Then he felt her faint breath against his coat. Relief nearly brought him to his knees. The little girl clung desperately to Sophie's hand. Is she dying? The child asked. No, Edward said firmly. Not while I can help her. Without hesitation, he removed his heavy riding coat and wrapped it around both Sophie and the child. Then he carefully lifted Sophie into his arms. The movement caused the sapphire locket to slide free once more. It rested against her chest exactly where it had 5 years ago, as though some part of her had never stopped belonging to him. Edward mounted his horse, holding Sophie securely while the child sat before him. The storm raged around them as he turned toward Ashford Hall. 5 years of searching had ended on a muddy road beneath a violent sky. Yet as he rode through the darkness, one terrible question refused to leave him. If Sophie had never intended to abandon him, then who had stolen 5 years of their lives? Sophie remained unconscious for 2 days. During those endless hours, Edward rarely left her bedside. The physicians assured him she would recover, yet fear lingered stubbornly within him. 5 years earlier she had vanished beyond his reach. Now she lay only a few feet away and still he felt powerless. Rain continued to fall outside Ashford Hall. Its steady rhythm echoed against tall windows while servants moved quietly through the manor, careful not to disturb the fragile peace surrounding the Duchess's chamber. The orphan girl refused to leave Sophie's side as well. Her name was Clara. She slept in a nearby room and spent every waking moment asking whether Sophie would recover. Edward answered her patiently each time. The child's devotion revealed more than words ever could. Whatever life Sophie had lived during the past 5 years, she had not faced it alone. On the morning of the 3rd day, sunlight finally pierced the clouds. Golden light slipped across the bed. Sophie's eyelashes fluttered. Then her eyes opened. For a moment she seemed confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then she saw Edward. Neither spoke. Years of separation stood silently between them. The room felt smaller suddenly. The air itself seemed charged with memories. Edward rose slowly from his chair. Sophie. His voice carried emotions he could no longer conceal. Relief, hope, fear, love. Her eyes filled instantly. You found me. The words were barely audible. Edward swallowed hard. I never stopped looking. A tear slid down her cheek. Neither attempted to hide their pain. Too much had happened. Too much had been lost. Silence lingered before Sophie glanced toward the window. I thought you hated me. The confession landed like a blade. Edward stared at her. Hated you. She closed her eyes briefly. The letters. Confusion crossed his face. What letters? Sophie slowly turned toward him. The hurt she had carried for years still lived behind her eyes. You wrote that our marriage was a mistake. Edward felt the world tilt beneath him. No. You wrote that you regretted choosing me. No. You wrote that another woman would make a better Duchess. The color drained from Edward's face. "I never wrote any of those things." The certainty in his voice stunned her. For several seconds neither moved, neither breathed. Then Sophie looked away. The possibility was too terrible to consider. Slowly she described every letter she had received, every cruel sentence, every painful implication, every message that convinced her she had become unwanted. Edward listened in growing horror. Each detail deepened his realization. Someone had deliberately destroyed their marriage. When she finished speaking, silence settled heavily across the room. Edward crossed to a writing desk. Moments later he returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside were dozens of letters, every one written by Sophie before her disappearance. He placed them gently before her. "I received these." Sophie's eyes widened. She opened the first, then the second, then the third. Confusion quickly became disbelief. The handwriting belonged to her, yet the words did not. Several letters portrayed her as distant and unhappy. Others suggested she regretted marrying beneath her expectations. One even hinted she wished to leave Ashford Hall permanently. "I never wrote these." Edward nodded slowly. "I know." The realization struck them simultaneously. Both had been deceived. Both had been manipulated. Someone had stood between them for years, carefully poisoning every bridge that connected their hearts. The truth hurt almost as much as the separation itself, because suddenly the lost years felt avoidable, preventable, stolen. Tears filled Sophie's eyes once more. "I wasted 5 years believing you never loved me." Edward knelt beside the bed. His expression softened. "Then we both suffered for the same lie." Their eyes met. The old connection remained. Bruised, wounded, but alive. For the first time since her return, genuine warmth passed between them. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. And understanding was a beginning. Over the following days, Sophie's strength gradually returned. As she recovered, fragments of her lost years emerged. She spoke of small villages where nobody knew her title. She described harsh winters spent sewing clothes for families who could barely afford bread. She told stories of working in kitchens, tending gardens, and sleeping in rented rooms. She spoke little about her own suffering. Instead, she remembered people. The widow who shared soup during a snowstorm. The baker who offered work when she had nowhere else to go. The elderly couple who treated her like a daughter. Edward listened carefully. The stories revealed the woman she had become. Harder, stronger, yet somehow even kinder than before. Eventually she told him about Clara. 3 years earlier, she had found the child alone after a fever claimed her parents. No relatives came forward. No one wanted responsibility. So Sophie became the family Clara no longer had. The little girl soon appeared inseparable from her. Watching them together stirred something deep within Edward. A future he thought he had lost forever suddenly felt possible again. Yet while hope slowly returned to Ashford Hall, danger was awakening elsewhere. Lord Rhys Blackthorne received news of Sophie's return late one evening. The messenger barely finished speaking before Rhys dismissed him. Then he poured himself a drink. His hand trembled slightly. For years he had believed Sophie gone forever. For years his carefully constructed lies had remained hidden. Now everything threatened to collapse. His gaze drifted toward estate ledgers spread across his desk. Forged signatures, altered accounts, stolen funds. Every crime depended upon silence. And Sophie represented catastrophe. Because if Edward learned the truth, everything would be lost. Rhys's jaw tightened. Panic slowly transformed into determination. He had worked too long to surrender now. Meanwhile, Edward quietly began investigating. The forged letters provided the first clue. Trusted lawyers examined documents. Servants were questioned. Old records resurfaced. Small inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. Missing correspondence. Strange financial transactions. Witnesses whose stories no longer aligned. The pattern pointed increasingly toward one man. Rhys. The realization sickened Edward. Betrayal from an enemy would have been painful. Betrayal from family felt monstrous. Days later, another discovery emerged. A former servant admitted seeing Rhys near the private mail room years earlier. Another remembered him intercepting deliveries intended for Sophie. The web tightened, and Rhys felt it. The pressure. The approaching exposure. The inevitable collapse. Desperation began replacing caution. One stormy evening, Sophie sat alone in the manor's glass conservatory. Clara had already gone to bed. Edward remained occupied with investigators. Rain tapped softly against the glass ceiling while candlelight flickered among rows of roses. For the first time in years, Sophie allowed herself to imagine happiness. Perhaps healing was possible. Perhaps love had survived. Perhaps the future contained more than grief. Then a shadow moved beyond the doorway. Her smile vanished. A figure slipped silently into the conservatory. Dark clothing concealed every feature. Before Sophie could react, the stranger lunged forward. Steel flashed in the candlelight. And somewhere inside Ashford Hall, a scream shattered the night. Sophie's scream echoed through Ashford Hall like a gunshot. The sound reached Edward before reason did. He was already running when another crash followed from the direction of the conservatory. His heart slammed against his ribs as he raced through corridors illuminated by flickering candlelight. Fear transformed every second into agony. Not again. He could not lose her again. Edward burst through the conservatory doors. The scene before him froze time itself. A masked man stood over Sophie. A knife gleamed in his hand. One shattered flowerpot lay scattered across the marble floor where Sophie had evidently fought back. Roses and broken glass littered the room. The attacker lunged. Edward crossed the distance without hesitation. He struck the man hard enough to send both of them crashing into a table. Glass exploded. The knife skidded across the floor. The struggle became immediate and brutal. Years of desperation fueled Edward's strength. The masked man fought fiercely, but panic weakened his judgment. Within moments Edward forced him against a stone pillar. Guards rushed into the conservatory. The attacker attempted one final escape. A guard intercepted him. Another tackled him to the ground. The struggle ended. Heavy breathing filled the room. Edward turned instantly towards Sophie. She stood trembling beside a rose arbor, one hand protecting her stomach. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. Only then did he realize how violently she was shaking. "It's over," he whispered. But deep down both knew it was not. Not yet. The captured attacker refused to speak initially. However, fear eventually succeeded where loyalty failed. By dawn he had confessed everything. He had been hired. Paid handsomely. Given one simple instruction. Silence Sophie Ashford forever. When investigators demanded the name of the employer, the answer confirmed Edward's darkest suspicion. Lord Rhys Blackthorne. The revelation spread through Ashford Hall like wildfire. Shock quickly became outrage. 4 years Rhys had presented himself as a loyal cousin, trusted advisor, and devoted member of the family. Behind that mask had existed something far darker. Edward ordered a full investigation. Nothing would remain hidden. Nothing. Within days, lawyers, accountants, and magistrates descended upon Ashford Hall. Every record was examined. Every transaction reviewed. Every signature questioned. What they uncovered exceeded even Edward's fears. Rhys had spent years stealing from estate accounts. He had forged financial documents. He had manipulated contracts. He had bribed servants. He had intercepted private correspondence. And at the center of every crime stood the same objective. The duchy. The inheritance. Power. By separating Edward and Sophie, Rhys had removed the greatest obstacle to his ambitions. No wife. No children. No heir. A lonely duke was vulnerable. A lonely duke could eventually be replaced. The scale of the betrayal stunned everyone involved. Yet no one suffered more than Edward. Every discovery revealed another piece of the life stolen from him. Years with his wife. Years with the family they should have built. Years that could never be returned. One evening, after reviewing yet another collection of forged documents, Edward found Sophie standing beside a window overlooking the gardens. Sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. For a moment neither spoke. Then Sophie reached for his hand. The simple gesture carried more comfort than any words. "We cannot change the past," she said softly. Edward looked at her. The woman standing before him had survived heartbreak, poverty, loneliness, and unimaginable grief. Yet she still possessed enough kindness to comfort others. Even him. Especially him. "I should have protected you." A sad smile touched her lips. "And I should have trusted you." The admission hung gently between them. Not as blame. As truth. Healing often began there. Their fingers intertwined. For the first time in years, the future seemed larger than the pain behind them. But fate had one final trial waiting. Later that night, Sophie awoke with a sharp pain. At first she dismissed it. Then another followed. And another. Within an hour, physicians filled the manor. The stress of recent events had triggered labor early. Panic swept through Ashford Hall. Servants hurried through corridors. Doctors issued instructions. Clara cried openly, terrified for Sophie. Edward never left her side. Not once. Not for a moment. Hours passed. The labor proved difficult. Each cry from behind the chamber doors felt like a blade twisting inside Edward's chest. He remembered another child. The baby lost years earlier. The future stolen from them before it had even begun. Fear whispered relentlessly. What if history repeated itself? What if happiness slipped away again? The questions haunted every passing minute. Near midnight, exhaustion lined Sophie's face. Yet determination burned within her eyes. Whenever she looked toward Edward, she seemed to find strength. Whenever he squeezed her hand, she held tighter. Together they endured the longest night of their lives. Outside, rain battered the windows. Inside, hope and fear fought a silent battle. Edward knelt beside the bed. His voice broke slightly. You came back to me. Sophie's eyes glistened. I never wanted to leave. Emotion tightened his throat. So stay. The words emerged almost as a prayer. Stay for the rest of our lives. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Before she could answer, another contraction seized her attention. The physicians moved quickly. The room filled with urgent voices. Then came silence. A long, unbearable silence. Edward's heart nearly stopped. One physician stepped forward. A smile slowly appeared upon his face. And then it happened. A baby's cry pierced the room. Strong, healthy, alive. The sound shattered every remaining shadow. Sophie began crying openly. Edward closed his eyes as relief overwhelmed him. For several moments neither could speak. The physician carefully placed the newborn into Sophie's arms. The child immediately quieted. Tiny fingers curled against a blanket. Tiny breaths rose and fell. Edward stared at his son. Their son. The heir who should have existed years earlier. A living symbol of everything they had survived. Sophie's gaze lifted toward him. Neither needed words. The child resting between them said everything. By dawn, celebration swept through Ashford Hall. Servants smiled openly. Bells rang across the estate. Even Clara laughed through tears when she finally met the baby. After years of sorrow, Ashford finally had an heir. Meanwhile, authorities tracked Reese to a remote coaching inn near the northern border. He was captured before sunrise attempting to flee the kingdom with stolen money and forged documents. Bound in chains, he was returned to face justice. As morning sunlight flooded the nursery, Edward stood beside Sophie while their newborn son slept peacefully in her arms. Beyond the windows, the estate awakened beneath clear skies for the first time in days. Yet even as hope settled over Ashford Hall, messengers were already carrying news across the kingdom. By week's end, every noble family in England would learn the truth. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. The announcement spread through England faster than any storm. Within days, noble households, government offices, and grand estates were discussing only one subject: the truth about Duchess Sophie Ashford. For 5 years, society had believed she abandoned her husband. For 5 years, whispers had followed her name through ballrooms and drawing rooms. For 5 years, Lord Reese Blackthorne had allowed those lies to flourish while hiding behind a mask of loyalty. Now the truth had emerged, and the kingdom could speak of nothing else. Ashford Hall prepared for a gathering unlike any in its history. Carriages arrived from every corner of the country. Noble families who had once judged Sophie now traveled great distances to witness the official proceedings. Judges, magistrates, wealthy landowners, and influential members of society filled the estate. The grand ballroom glittered beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers. Gold candlelight reflected across polished marble floors. Servants moved gracefully through the crowd. Yet despite the elegance surrounding them, a current of anticipation filled the air. Everyone knew they were about to witness the end of one story and the beginning of another. In a private chamber overlooking the gardens, Sophie stood before a mirror while a maid adjusted the final details of her gown. The deep sapphire silk matched the color of the wedding locket resting against her throat. She had worn the same locket through years of hardship, through loneliness, through grief, through fear. And now she wore it again inside the home she once believed she would never see. A soft knock sounded at the door. When Sophie turned, she found Edward standing there. For a moment neither spoke. The years had changed them both. Pain had left its marks. Yet something stronger had survived beneath the scars. Edward's gaze softened. You look beautiful. The compliment carried none of the polished charm expected from a duke. It carried sincerity, the kind that could only be earned through suffering. A faint smile touched Sophie's lips. You still become nervous before important occasions. Edward laughed quietly. I have spent 5 years searching for you. His eyes held hers. Oddly enough, this feels more frightening. The admission surprised a smile from her. For a few precious moments, the weight of the past seemed lighter. Then Clara entered carrying the newborn boy. The child immediately captured both their attention. Edward's expression changed the moment he saw his son. Wonder still appeared every time, as though he could hardly believe the child was real. Sophie watched him carefully. 5 years earlier she had lost one child. The memory would never disappear completely. But watching Edward cradle their son revealed something powerful. The future had finally become stronger than the past. Together they made their way toward the ballroom. Conversations faded as they entered. Hundreds of eyes followed them. For years Sophie had imagined this moment. Once she would have feared it. Now she simply walked forward. Because the truth stood beside her. At the front of the ballroom sat Lord Rhys Blackthorne. Iron restraints encircled his wrists. Guards surrounded him. Gone was the confident nobleman who had manipulated half the kingdom. His face appeared pale. His posture rigid. His future shattered. The proceedings began. One witness followed another. Former servants testified. Lawyers presented evidence. Investigators revealed forged documents. Financial records exposed theft. Letters demonstrated years of deception. Every lie Rhys had built was dismantled piece by piece. The process lasted hours. Yet nobody left. Nobody looked away. The story had become too extraordinary. A marriage destroyed by manipulation. A duchess driven away through deception. A husband searching for 5 years. An unborn child lost. A kingdom misled. And a villain hiding behind family loyalty. As the final evidence was presented, silence settled across the room. Rhys stared ahead. For the first time, there were no clever arguments remaining. No escape. No strategy. Only consequences. The chief magistrate rose. His voice echoed clearly through the ballroom. After listing the crimes, he delivered the judgment. Rhys Blackthorne would spend the remainder of his life imprisoned. A murmur spread through the crowd. Justice had finally arrived. Rhys closed his eyes. Everything he had sacrificed his soul to obtain was gone. The title, the power, the future, all lost. The guards led him away. No one stopped them. No one spoke in his defense. The doors closed behind him. And with that sound, 5 years of darkness finally ended. Yet the most important moment of the day had not arrived. Edward stepped forward. The ballroom immediately fell silent. Every face turned toward him. The Duke looked across the gathering before his gaze settled upon Sophie. Emotion filled his expression. Raw, honest, unhidden. When he finally spoke, his voice carried throughout the hall. 5 years ago, I lost the woman I loved. Silence deepened. I searched every road I could find. Every village, every city, every rumor. His eyes never left Sophie's. People told me she was gone. A pause followed. They told me she abandoned me. Another pause. They told me to move on. His voice grew quieter. But my heart refused. Many guests lowered their eyes. Others wiped away tears. Because the truth inside his words could not be denied. He had loved her long after hope should have died. Edward slowly crossed the ballroom. Every step felt significant. Every heartbeat echoed through the silence. When he reached Sophie, he stopped. For one brief moment, emotion threatened to overcome him. Then he did something nobody expected. The Duke of Ashford knelt before his wife. Gasps filled the room. Nobles stared in disbelief. Servants exchanged astonished glances. Yet Edward noticed none of it. His entire world existed in the woman standing before him. 5 years of searching. 5 years of regret. 5 years of longing. All led to this moment. He reached for her hand. Sophie Ashford. His voice trembled slightly. Years ago, I asked you to become my Duchess. Tears gathered in Sophie's eyes. Edward continued. Today, I am asking something far more important. The ballroom held its breath. Will you stay beside me not because of duty, titles, or promises? His grip tightened gently around her fingers. Will you stay because I love you? A tear escaped down Sophie's cheek. Then another. For several seconds she could not speak. The emotions were too large, too deep, too overwhelming. She looked at the man before her. The man who had searched for 5 years. The man who never stopped believing she was alive. The man who stood beside her through danger, childbirth, and heartbreak. The man she had never truly stopped loving. A soft smile appeared through her tears. Yes. The single word shattered the remaining distance between them. Applause erupted instantly. Cheers followed. Even dignified nobles joined the celebration. Edward rose and pulled her gently into his arms. For a long moment the ballroom disappeared. Only they remained. When they finally turned toward the crowd, Clara stepped forward holding the baby. The little girl looked nervous. Edward knelt before her. You saved Sophie when she had nobody. Clara looked down shyly. I only stayed with my family. The answer nearly broke Sophie's heart. Edward smiled warmly. Then perhaps it is time to make it official. Understanding slowly dawned in Clara's eyes. Tears immediately followed. Sophie embraced her. The child who once feared being alone suddenly belonged somewhere forever. The crowd applauded again. Soon afterward, Edward lifted his son before the gathered guests. The infant blinked sleepily beneath the chandelier light. The future heir of Ashford. The child whose existence represented hope, survival, and renewal. The hall erupted with celebration. Hours later, the gathering finally ended. As evening settled across the estate, Edward, Sophie, Clara, and their newborn son stepped onto the front terrace overlooking the gardens. The rain that had haunted so much of their story was finally gone. Golden sunlight broke through the clouds. Its warm glow stretched across the estate, illuminating every field, every tree, every stone of Ashford Hall. Edward wrapped an arm around Sophie. Clara stood beside them. Their son rested peacefully in Sophie's arms. Together they watched the sunlight spread across the horizon. 5 years earlier, a lie had torn their family apart. Now truth had brought them home. And beneath a sky washed clean by rain, the Duke and Duchess who never stopped loving each other finally stepped into the future they were always meant to share.